In the early morning darkness of June 4, 1942, at precisely 4:30 in the morning, a remarkable scene unfolded aboard the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi. The ship was positioned 240 nautical miles to the northwest of Midway Atoll, and on its bridge stood Commander Minoru Genda, a man who, despite battling a severe case of pneumonia, had refused to remain in his quarters. Instead, he stood watching the preparations in his pajamas, determined to witness what he and every other Japanese officer believed would be another overwhelming victory for the Imperial Japanese Navy. The force that surrounded the Akagi that morning represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval power. Stretching across the dark Pacific waters were 4 massive aircraft carriers, accompanied by 11 battleships and supported by more than 200 vessels of various types. This armada constituted the most formidable naval striking force that Japan had ever managed to assemble in its entire maritime history. The men who commanded and crewed these ships carried with them an unshakable confidence, born from 6 consecutive months of warfare in which they had never experienced defeat. Every engagement, every battle, every confrontation had ended in Japanese victory, and there seemed no reason whatsoever to believe that this pattern would not continue. The achievements of the Imperial Japanese Navy since the beginning of the war had been nothing short of spectacular. When they struck Pearl Harbor, they had managed to sink or severely damage 8 American battleships in a single morning. Following that devastating blow, Japanese forces had swept across the Philippines, overwhelming American and Filipino defenders. The British, long considered masters of naval warfare, had been utterly humiliated at Singapore. Japanese armies and naval forces had seized an enormous empire that now spanned an incredible 20 million square miles across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Now, with this massive fleet, they intended to eliminate whatever remained of American naval power in the Pacific Ocean, finishing what they had started at Pearl Harbor. What Commander Genda believed as he stood on that bridge, what every Japanese officer from the highest admiral to the most junior ensign firmly accepted as fact, was that the Americans possessed at most 2 operational aircraft carriers anywhere in the entire Pacific theater. Intelligence reports suggested these carriers were most likely operating somewhere in the South Pacific region, far from where the Japanese intended to strike. The carrier Yorktown, which had been heavily damaged during the recent Battle of the Coral Sea, would, according to all reasonable Japanese estimates, require many months of repair work before she could possibly return to action. The Japanese had maintained complete radio silence throughout their approach to Midway, and this silence had given them absolute confidence that their security remained intact. Not a single Japanese officer suspected that Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding American forces in the Pacific, had been systematically reading their encrypted messages for many weeks. The American codebreakers had achieved what would prove to be one of the most crucial intelligence breakthroughs in military history. They had successfully cracked the Japanese naval code known as JN-25B, gaining access to Japanese operational planning and communications. While Commander Genda studied his navigation charts and attack plans aboard the Akagi, completely unaware of this catastrophic security breach, 2 133 American aircraft were at that very moment being armed and fueled aboard 3 aircraft carriers that, according to every Japanese calculation and assessment, simply were not supposed to exist in that part of the ocean. These American carriers were positioned exactly where they needed to be to spring a devastating ambush. Within the span of just 14 hours from that moment when Genda stood on the bridge of the Akagi, the Imperial Japanese Navy would suffer what would be its first truly decisive defeat of the entire war. 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers would be lost, sunk beneath the waves. 3,057 of Japan's finest naval aviators, mechanics, and crew members would perish in the flames and waters of the Pacific. The carefully cultivated myth of Japanese invincibility, which had seemed so unassailable just hours before, would sink alongside those burning carriers. The entire strategic balance of the Pacific War would shift permanently in a matter of minutes. When one examined the mathematical realities of naval power in the Pacific at that moment, the numbers appeared to favor Japan overwhelmingly. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant commander of the combined fleet, had assembled resources that completely dwarfed what the Americans could possibly deploy. Japan brought 8 aircraft carriers into the theatre compared to America's mere 3. Japan deployed 11 battleships while the Americans could field none at all in this engagement. Japanese forces could launch 248 aircraft, slightly more than the roughly 233 that the Americans might manage. The operational plan that the Japanese designated as Operation MOMI involved coordinating the movements of approximately 200 vessels operating across millions upon millions of square miles of ocean. According to official Japanese action reports compiled before the battle, this assessment of American weakness appeared entirely justified by recent events. In the 6 months that had elapsed since the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese military forces had achieved victories that exceeded even their own optimistic projections. The surrender of Singapore had resulted in the capture of 85,000 British and Commonwealth troops, one of the most humiliating defeats in British military history. Japanese naval forces had utterly destroyed the combined American, British, Dutch and Australian fleet in the Battle of the Java Sea. The conquest of Burma had opened the door to potential operations against India. Each successive victory had reinforced the deeply held Japanese belief in their own superiority and the corresponding weakness of their enemies. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who commanded the First Air Fleet with its powerful carrier striking force, had actually expressed certain concerns about the operation's complexity during staff planning meetings. His Chief of Staff, Rear Admiral Ryunosuke Kusaka, had specifically warned that the elaborate plan violated fundamental principles of concentration of force, spreading Japanese units too thinly across too vast an area. However, these concerns had been systematically dismissed by higher command. After all, these same officers had voiced similar doubts before the Pearl Harbor operation, and that attack had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Why should this operation be any different? The Japanese Navy proceeded into battle operating under several assumptions that would prove absolutely fatal to their cause. These assumptions, carefully documented in post-war interrogations and captured records, included the firm belief that American carriers were operating in the South Pacific, far from Midway. They assumed that the Yorktown specifically would require at least 3 months of repair time before she could possibly return to operational status. Japanese planners had convinced themselves that American torpedo bombers had proven themselves completely ineffective in previous engagements. They believed that American pilots generally lacked sufficient experience compared to Japanese aviators. Most critically and most catastrophically, they assumed that their maintenance of complete radio silence throughout the operation absolutely guaranteed that they would achieve complete surprise when they struck at Midway. While Japanese officers confidently made these assumptions, at Station Hypo, located deep in the basement of the headquarters building at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort led an extraordinary team of cryptanalysts and codebreakers who were working under incredibly difficult conditions. They laboured in stifling heat in cramped basement spaces, working around the clock to break Japanese codes. By May of 1942, Rochefort's team had achieved the capability to read portions of 15 to 20% of all Japanese naval communications traffic. More importantly, they were reading the most crucial portions, the operational orders and planning documents that revealed Japanese intentions. The breakthrough that would directly lead to American victory at Midway came through meticulous and brilliant analytical work. Japanese messages that Rochefort's team intercepted repeatedly mentioned a location designated as AF as the objective for a major upcoming operation. Rochefort developed a strong suspicion that AF represented Midway Atoll, but he needed confirmation. To obtain this proof, Captain Jasper Holmes, one of Rochefort's officers, suggested an ingenious deception operation. The American command arranged for Midway to transmit an uncoded plain-language emergency message reporting that the island's water distillation plant had suffered mechanical problems and that fresh water supplies were running dangerously low. 2 days after this message was transmitted, Japanese intelligence filed a report using their supposedly secure JN-25B code, informing Japanese commands that the AF Air Unit was experiencing shortages of fresh water. This confirmation was exactly what Rochefort needed. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, who served as Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer, later provided testimony to congressional investigators about the extent of American knowledge before the battle. His statement was remarkable in its completeness. The Americans knew the Japanese objectives, they knew the routes that Japanese forces would take to reach those objectives, and they knew the timetables that Japanese forces would follow. American intelligence could predict with remarkable accuracy which specific ships would be in which locations at which times. This intelligence coup extended far beyond simply knowing where the Japanese would strike. American cryptanalysts had determined not just the location, but the complete Japanese order of battle, listing every major unit that would participate. They knew the date of the attack with precision, either June 4th or June 5th. They even knew the specific approach routes that different Japanese forces would take. This extraordinarily detailed intelligence allowed Admiral Nimitz to position his 3 available carriers in the one sector northeast of Midway, where Japanese search patterns, as revealed through intercepted communications, would provide inadequate coverage. The Americans would be lying in wait, completely unseen, while the Japanese believed they were achieving complete surprise. The story of the carrier Yorktown provided a vivid demonstration of American industrial capability and determination. The ship had been damaged during the Battle of the Coral Sea, suffering a bomb hit that penetrated completely through her flight deck. Near misses from other bombs had ruptured fuel tanks and caused additional structural damage. Japanese intelligence services, working with their understanding of typical repair timelines, estimated that the Yorktown would require a minimum of 3 months in a naval shipyard before she could possibly return to combat operations. The repair crews at Pearl Harbor accomplished the seemingly impossible task in just 72 hours of continuous work. According to official United States Navy maintenance records, 1,400 skilled workers labored without meaningful rest from May 27th through May 29th. Such was the urgency of the work that repair teams actually remained aboard the ship even after she departed Pearl Harbor, continuing their work during the voyage to the battle area around Midway. The speed of this repair seemed literally impossible to Japanese planners, whose own procedures and facilities required weeks to accomplish similar repairs. At 4:30 on the morning of June 4th, Admiral Nagumo gave the order to launch the first strike wave against Midway Island. 108 aircraft lifted off from the 4 Japanese carriers in what was by all accounts a flawlessly executed launch operation. The strike force consisted of 36 Kate torpedo bombers loaded with fragmentation bombs for use against ground targets, 36 Valdive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters providing escort and protection. The launch proceeded with the precision and expertise that had been gained through 6 consecutive months of successful combat operations. Japanese flight deck crews had become perhaps the most skilled in the world at launching aircraft quickly and efficiently. However, Admiral Nagumo made a critical decision that morning that would have profound consequences. This decision, documented in surviving Japanese action reports recovered after the war, concerned the reconnaissance search patterns. Naval doctrine called for launching 22 search aircraft to provide comprehensive coverage of the ocean around the fleet. Nagumo instead launched only 7 search planes. Even worse, an 8th search plane that was supposed to launch from the heavy cruiser Tone suffered a catapult malfunction that delayed its launch by 30 minutes. This 30-minute delay would prove absolutely catastrophic to Japanese hopes. At 26 minutes past 5 that morning, American PBY Catalina flying boats operating from Midway Island spotted the incoming Japanese fleet. At 7 minutes before 6, radar installations on Midway detected the incoming Japanese strike force. Every single flyable aircraft on Midway was immediately scrambled to either intercept the attackers or to strike at the Japanese carriers. Marine fighter pilots, torpedo bomber crews, dive bomber crews, even Army Air Force B-17 heavy bomber crews took to the air. The Americans had been expecting this attack and were as ready as they could possibly be. At 7 o'clock that morning, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who was leading the Midway strike force, transmitted a radio message back to the carriers that would trigger the fatal series of decisions. His message stated clearly that there was a definite need for a second attack wave against Midway. The island's defences had proven much stronger and more resilient than Japanese planning had anticipated. The airfield remained operational despite the bombing, and American aircraft continued to operate from it. This message created an immediate tactical dilemma for Admiral Nagumo. Nagumo faced what would prove to be the critical decision of the entire battle. His second wave of aircraft, held in reserve aboard the carriers, had been armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes specifically intended for use against enemy ships, should American naval vessels appear. However, since no enemy fleet had been detected by the inadequate search patterns, and since Tomonaga was reporting the need for another strike against Midway, Nagumo made his decision. At 15 minutes past 7, he issued the order for these reserve aircraft to be rearmed with fragmentation bombs suitable for attacking ground targets. This order, preserved in surviving Japanese operational logs, initiated what would become chaos on the hangar decks of the four carriers. Proper Japanese doctrine specified that when ordnance was being changed on aircraft, the bombs and torpedoes that were removed should be immediately returned to the armoured magazines deep within the ship for safe storage. However, time was of the essence, and the urgency of the situation led to a fatal shortcut being taken. Instead of properly storing the removed ordnance, bombs and torpedoes were simply stacked on the hangar decks near the aircraft, creating an incredibly dangerous situation where live explosives sat exposed throughout the ships. At 28 minutes past 7, the delayed search plane from the cruiser Tone, the one that had launched 30 minutes late due to catapult problems, finally transmitted its first contact report. The message was maddeningly vague, but electrifying in its implications. The pilot reported sighting what appeared to be 10 enemy surface ships at a bearing of 10 degrees, at a distance of 240 miles from Midway. This report triggered frantic activity throughout the Japanese command. Were these the American carriers they feared, or merely supporting vessels? At 15 minutes before 8, Admiral Nagumo sent an urgent message demanding clarification on ship types. The response to this critical question would not arrive for 30 agonizing minutes, 30 minutes during which the situation continued to deteriorate. Between 20 minutes past 9 and 20 minutes past 10 that morning, 3 separate American torpedo squadrons located the Japanese carrier force and pressed home their attacks. These attacks appeared to be nothing less than suicidal to observers on both sides. The American aircraft were obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, slow and vulnerable machines that could manage only 120 knots of airspeed while flying straight and level to deliver their torpedo attacks. They faced Zero fighters capable of 330 knots, flown by some of the most experienced combat pilots in the world. The result was predictable and horrific. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet attacked first, flying in from one direction without any fighter escort or dive bomber support. Of the 15 aircraft that made this attack, 14 were shot down almost immediately. The slaughter was methodical and complete. Ensign George Gay was the sole survivor of this squadron, forced to watch from the water where he clung to a floating seat cushion as his entire squadron was systematically annihilated around him. His after-action report, written after his eventual rescue, described in chilling detail how Zero fighters made repeated passes through the torpedo bomber formation, methodically destroying each aircraft in turn. The Japanese pilots showed no mercy and no hesitation. Torpedo Squadron 6 from the carrier Enterprise fared only slightly better, losing 10 aircraft out of 14 that attacked. Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown lost 10 out of 12 aircraft. The mathematical result of these 3 separate attacks was devastating to the Americans in terms of aircraft and personnel losses. Not a single torpedo launched by these brave crews managed to hit a Japanese ship. The attacks appeared to be complete failures, costly disasters that achieved absolutely nothing. Japanese after-action reports dismissed these attacks as demonstrating great bravery but terrible tactics and obsolete equipment. The Americans had thrown away dozens of aircraft and the lives of their crews for no result whatsoever. Or so it seemed to the Japanese observers. What the Japanese officers did not realize, what they could not see from their perspective, was that these seemingly futile torpedo attacks had accomplished something of crucial importance. Every single Zero fighter in the Japanese combat air patrol had been pulled down to sea level to engage these low-flying torpedo bombers. The Zero pilots had become completely focused on the slow-moving targets directly in front of them. The result was that high altitude remained completely undefended. There were no Japanese fighters positioned at altitude to intercept dive bombers. The door to disaster stood wide open. At 20 minutes past 10, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey arrived overhead with his dive bomber squadron from the Enterprise. McCluskey had performed a minor miracle of navigation simply to find the Japanese fleet. He had flown to the calculated intercept point and found nothing but empty ocean. Rather than turning back when fuel began to run low, he made a logical deduction based on his experience and turned north. His decision was rewarded when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing at high speed across the water. Following this destroyer's wake back toward the main body, McCluskey soon found himself directly above the Japanese carriers. According to his after-action report, written while memories were still fresh, the sight that greeted him was extraordinary. The carrier flight decks were spotted with aircraft that were clearly being readied for launch. Ordnance and fuel lines were visible. And most remarkable of all, no Japanese fighters were visible at high altitude. The carriers were completely vulnerable. At 22 minutes past 10 in the morning, the attack that would change the course of the war began. Lieutenant Richard Best led his dive bomber section down toward the carrier Akagi. His 1,000-pound armor-piercing bomb, dropped from high altitude with great precision, penetrated completely through the carrier's flight deck and exploded deep within the hangar deck. The explosion occurred among the stacked ordnance that had been removed from aircraft during the rearming operation. Within seconds, massive induced explosions began ripping through the ship as bombs and torpedoes detonated. The ship's insides were being torn apart by its own munitions. At virtually the same moment, dive bombers from the Yorktown struck the carrier Soryu. 3 bombs hit the carrier in rapid succession, and within 20 seconds the ship had been transformed into a raging inferno. Fires spread with impossible speed through the ship's interior. Meanwhile, additional dive bombers from Enterprise located the carrier Kaga and scored 4 direct hits. The first bomb penetrated near the forward elevator and exploded among fueled and armed aircraft on the hangar deck. The resulting fires and explosions began to consume the ship. By 8 minutes past 10, barely 6 minutes after the dive bomber attack had begun, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were mortally wounded, burning uncontrollably with fires that would ultimately doom them. The mathematical precision of this attack was stunning to both sides. Of 41 American dive bombers that had attacked the 3 carriers, only 3 had been shot down by Japanese defenses. In the span of just 6 minutes, in 6 extraordinary minutes of combat, the entire balance of naval power in the Pacific had shifted permanently and irrevocably in America's favor. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never recover from these 6 minutes of devastation. The Japanese carriers died slowly and agonizingly over many hours, their destruction documented in extraordinary detail by surviving officers who were interrogated after the war ended. The Akagi burned for nearly 12 full hours after being hit. Captain Taijiro Aoki, the ship's commanding officer, remained aboard attempting every possible salvage measure. He tried desperately to control the fires, but they spread through the ship faster than they could be contained. Finally, at 2 o'clock in the morning on June 5th, Admiral Yamamoto himself sent a direct order that the ship must be abandoned. At 10 minutes before 5 in the morning, Japanese destroyers moved alongside and fired 4 Type 93 torpedoes into the burning hulk to prevent any possibility of American capture. The Akagi sank at 20 minutes past 5 with 267 of her crew dead. The fires aboard the carrier Kaga proved absolutely uncontrollable because the bomb damage had ruptured the ship's fire suppression mains. Without water pressure to fight the flames, the fires spread throughout the vessel. Commander Takahisa Amagai, finding all efforts futile, ordered the ship abandoned at 40 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. The Kaga exploded in a massive detonation at 25 minutes past 7 that evening and sank shortly thereafter. Her casualties totaled 811 dead, the highest death toll of any of the 4 carriers lost that day. The carrier Soryu burned for 9 hours before finally sinking at 7:30 on the evening of June 4th. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto, the ship's commanding officer, made the decision to go down with his vessel. According to testimony from survivors who managed to escape the ship, Yanagimoto was last seen standing on the bridge as the ship slipped beneath the waves. 711 men died aboard the Soryu. The carrier Hiryu, the sole survivor of the morning attack, managed to launch 2 separate strike waves before American dive bombers found her. The first Hiryu strike damaged the Yorktown with 3 bomb hits. The second strike, consisting of torpedo bombers, put 2 torpedoes into the Yorktown's hull, inflicting what appeared to be mortal damage. However, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, American dive bombers from Enterprise located the Hiryu and scored 4 direct bomb hits on the last operational Japanese carrier. The Hiryu burned through the night and finally sank at 9 o'clock on the morning of June 5th. Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, who commanded the carrier division, and Captain Tomeo Kaku, the ship's captain, both chose to remain aboard and go down with the Hiryu. 416 men died aboard that final carrier. The survival of the Yorktown, at least for several days, demonstrated the superiority of American damage control techniques and training. Despite taking 3 bomb hits from Hiryu's first strike and then 2 torpedo hits from the second strike, the carrier remained afloat for 2 full days afterward. American damage control parties fought fires, repaired damage, and managed to keep the ship from sinking. Only when the Japanese submarine Torai 168 managed to penetrate the destroyer screen on June 6th and put additional torpedoes into the stricken carrier did the Yorktown finally succumb. She rolled over and sank on June 7th, the last major casualty of the battle. The final accounting of losses told the story starkly. American forces lost 307 men killed, 1 fleet carrier, 1 destroyer, the Hammond, which was sunk while alongside the Yorktown, and 150 aircraft. Japanese forces lost 3,057 men killed, 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, the Mikuma, which was sunk by American aircraft on June 6th, 248 aircraft, and most critically, 110 absolutely irreplaceable veteran aircrew whose experience could never be adequately replaced. Analysis conducted after the war revealed the completeness and extent of American intelligence superiority. A historical study compiled by the National Security Agency and declassified in 2006 confirmed that Station Hypo's code-breaking team had provided Admiral Nimitz with remarkably accurate intelligence. They had provided the accurate date of attack within a margin of error of only 1 day. They had compiled a complete Japanese order of battle, listing every major unit. They had determined the approach routes and deployment patterns. They had even learned of the Japanese plan to occupy Midway following its capture. The study's conclusion was remarkable, stating that no military operation in recorded history had ever begun with such complete intelligence about enemy intentions. The Americans knew what was coming, where it was coming from, and when it would arrive. At 5 minutes before midnight on June 4th, Admiral Yamamoto made the extraordinarily difficult decision to cancel Operation MI entirely and ordered a general withdrawal of all Japanese forces. Yamamoto was aboard the massive super battleship Yamato, positioned 300 miles behind the carriers. He commanded the most powerful surface fleet of battleships ever assembled, yet he was completely powerless to affect the outcome of the carrier battle. According to the official Japanese action report filed after the battle, Yamamoto seriously considered attempting a night surface engagement using his overwhelming superiority in battleships. His staff officers performed calculations showing they could reach the American fleet's estimated position by 2 o'clock in the morning. However, without any air cover and facing American carriers at dawn, when those carriers would launch strikes against battleships that had no air defense, the staff concluded that the risk was completely unacceptable. The decision to retreat marked the first time in the entire war that a Japanese operation had been cancelled and abandoned specifically due to enemy action rather than being completed according to plan. The impact of the Midway defeat extended far beyond the immediate loss of ships and personnel. Japan's strategic initiative in the Pacific Theatre ended definitively on June 4, 1942. Every subsequent operation that Japan attempted would be fundamentally defensive or reactive in nature. The Japanese would never again seize the initiative and force the Americans to respond to Japanese moves. The losses among pilots and aircrew proved to be completely irreplaceable over time. The 110 aircrew who died at Midway averaged more than 800 flight hours of experience each. Many of these men were veterans who had been flying combat missions since the China incident began in 1937. They represented years of training and combat experience. Japan's pre-war training system had been designed to produce approximately 100 pilots annually under peacetime conditions. The United States Navy was already training 2,500 pilots per year and rapidly expanding that capacity. Japanese naval doctrine, which was based on the concept of the decisive battle derived from their spectacular victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905, proved to be completely obsolete in the face of modern carrier warfare. The Americans demonstrated conclusively that naval warfare had fundamentally transformed into a contest of industrial production capacity and intelligence gathering, rather than warrior spirit and tactical excellence in a single climactic battle. Verified production statistics compiled during and after the war revealed the complete hopelessness of Japan's position once the industrial competition began in earnest. In the category of carrier production from the time of Midway until the war's end, Japan managed to complete 12 carriers of all types. The United States completed 141 carriers, including 17 fleet carriers and 124 escort carriers. In aircraft production between 1942 and 1945, Japan produced approximately 65,000 aircraft of all types. The United States produced 297,000 aircraft. In pilot training by 1944, Japanese pilots were being rushed through accelerated programs and averaged only 150 to 200 flight hours before being sent into combat. American pilots averaged more than 600 hours of training before seeing their first combat. In terms of overall industrial capacity, the United States' national income was 17 times larger than Japan's even before the war began. The United States provided 2/3 of all Allied military equipment used in the entire global conflict. Japanese post-war technical analysis, conducted with brutal honesty, revealed systematic vulnerabilities throughout their carrier designs and operational procedures. The carriers themselves had fundamental design flaws. Their enclosed hangar decks trapped explosions and prevented gases from dissipating. Fire suppression systems were inadequate for dealing with major blazes. Damage control procedures were poorly developed and executed. Ventilation systems were insufficient. Japanese aircraft, particularly the famous Zero fighter, had critical vulnerabilities. The Zero achieved its remarkable performance characteristics by sacrificing pilot protection. The aircraft lacked armor plating to protect the pilot and lacked self-sealing fuel tanks that would prevent fires when hit. The result was high performance but extremely poor survivability. Japan also lacked any effective pilot rescue system, meaning that pilots who were forced to ditch in the ocean were rarely recovered. Japanese operational deficiencies identified after the battle included inadequate search patterns, exemplified by the launch of only 7 search planes instead of the doctrinal 22. Radio discipline was poor despite the emphasis on maintaining silence. Tactical doctrine proved inflexible, unable to adapt when circumstances changed. These weaknesses were identified and recognized but never adequately corrected, even after the disaster at Midway. The critical role of intelligence in the American victory simply cannot be overstated. According to Admiral Nimitz's own post-war assessment of the battle, if American forces had lacked early information about Japanese movements and intentions, if American carrier forces had been caught dispersed across the Pacific as they might easily have been, the Battle of Midway would certainly have ended very differently. Station Hypo's achievement went far beyond the technical feat of breaking Japanese codes. They provided actionable intelligence that allowed precise positioning of American carriers exactly where they needed to be. They enabled the preparation of Midway's defences with full knowledge of what was coming. They allowed conservation of resources by avoiding Japanese diversionary feints. They made tactical surprise possible despite overwhelming numerical inferiority. Interrogations of Japanese officers after the war revealed numerous command problems that contributed to the disaster. Reconnaissance had been inadequate, a fact documented extensively in action reports. There had been vacillation and indecision over the rearming of aircraft, confirmed by multiple witness accounts. There was failure to launch available aircraft immediately when the fleet came under attack. There was poor coordination with supporting forces that were spread too far away to help. Strategic errors included the creation of an overly complex plan, requiring perfect timing across vast distances. Forces were divided for simultaneous operations, including the Aleutian campaign. American capabilities were systematically underestimated. Intelligence warnings about increased American radio traffic before the battle were ignored or dismissed. The loss of veteran pilots at Midway triggered a cascade effect throughout the rest of the war that can be traced through Japanese training records. Before Midway, Japanese pilot training required 500 to 700 hours spread over 2 years. After Midway, emergency training programs reduced this to 150 to 200 hours compressed into 4 months. By 1944, some Japanese pilots were being deployed to combat units with under 100 hours of total flight time. Meanwhile, American pilot quality improved continuously throughout the war. In 1942, American pilots averaged 400 hours of training. By 1943, this had increased to 500 hours. By 1944, American pilots were receiving more than 600 hours of training before entering combat. The experience gap between Japanese and American pilots became insurmountable. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, Japanese pilots averaged 200 hours of experience while facing American pilots with more than 600 hours of experience. The result was a massacre in which 346 Japanese aircraft were destroyed compared to only 30 American aircraft lost. Midway forced Japanese military planners to recognize American industrial supremacy, though this recognition came too late to change anything. According to captured Japanese planning documents analyzed after the war, their own calculations showed that matching United States carrier production would have required 300% of Japan's total steel production. Matching American aircraft production would have required 400% of Japan's aluminum production capacity, which simply did not exist. Matching American pilot training programs would have required fuel oil that Japan simply did not possess in adequate quantities. The mathematics of defeat were absolutely inescapable once the industrial competition began. The effects of the Midway defeat rippled through every subsequent Pacific operation. At Guadalcanal, beginning in August of 1942, Japan committed forces piecemeal, unable to concentrate the kind of carrier power that had been lost at Midway. At the Battle of Santa Cruz in October of 1942, Japan achieved a tactical victory by damaging American carriers, but lost 99 aircrew compared to only 26 American aircrew losses. This rate of attrition was completely unsustainable for Japan. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, Japan's painstakingly rebuilt carrier force was effectively destroyed, losing 476 aircraft and 450 highly trained aircrew in what American pilots nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Midway exposed technological disparities that only widened as the war progressed. In radar technology, Americans possessed shipboard radar that could detect aircraft at ranges far beyond visual observation. Japanese forces relied primarily on visual observation using lookouts. In communications, Americans had developed TBS, or talk between ships radio systems, that allowed rapid coordination between vessels. Japanese forces continued to rely heavily on signal flags and signal lights. In intelligence, Americans were reading the JN-25 code throughout most of the war. The Japanese never succeeded in breaking American naval codes. In production technology, Americans continuously improved their designs and incorporated lessons learned. Japanese factories lacked the ability to easily retool for modified designs. Post-war interrogations and published memoirs provide authenticated perspectives from participants on both sides. Captain Taijiro Aoki, who commanded the Akagi, testified in interrogation that the induced explosions from improperly stored ordnance on the hangar deck had doomed his ship. A single bomb hit that might have been survivable became absolutely catastrophic due to procedural failures and shortcuts taken during the rearming operation. Commander Yasuji Watanabe, who served as Admiral Yamamoto's operations officer, confirmed during his interrogation that Yamamoto had immediately recognized that the war was fundamentally lost after Midway, though this realization was never stated publicly for morale reasons. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, provided detailed after-action reports that offered crucial information about Japanese carrier operations and defensive tactics during the attack. Modern historians, particularly Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, in their definitive work Shattered Sword, published in 2005, have systematically corrected many myths about the battle that had persisted for decades. One common myth held that Japanese carriers were merely 5 minutes away from launching their counterattack when American dive bombers struck. Reality, as revealed by careful analysis of operational records, shows that a minimum of 30 to 40 minutes would have been required to complete launch operations. Another myth suggested that Admiral Nagumo should have launched a partial strike with whatever aircraft were ready rather than waiting for a coordinated attack. Reality shows that Japanese doctrine absolutely required coordinated attacks. Partial strikes were not something that Japanese carriers practiced or were trained to execute. Another myth portrayed Japanese reconnaissance as simply unlucky. Reality demonstrates that the inadequate search patterns were doctrinal and procedural, not accidental or the result of bad luck. The strategic lessons of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The battle proved conclusively that intelligence superiority could overcome numerical disadvantage. Admiral Chester Nimitz's official report stated clearly that the Battle of Midway was essentially a victory of intelligence. Americans knew Japanese intentions, strength, and schedule, while the Japanese knew nothing of American dispositions. Japanese naval historian Mitsuru Yoshida wrote after the war that following Midway, Japanese forces were defending rather than attacking. The decisive Battle of the Pacific War had been fought on June 4, 1942. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, which analyzed Japanese records comprehensively after the war ended, determined that the Japanese Navy never fully recovered from the losses suffered at Midway. Every subsequent operation was fundamentally constrained by the losses of June 4 and 5, 1942. A comprehensive statistical summary of the battle reveals the scope of forces engaged and losses suffered. Japan committed 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers, along with numerous smaller vessels and support ships. Aircraft strength included 248 carrier-based aircraft and 127 land-based aircraft operating from various island bases. The United States committed 3 fleet carriers, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. American aircraft strength totaled approximately 233 aircraft, including both carrier-based and land-based aircraft operating from Midway. Japanese losses totaled 4 fleet carriers sunk, 1 heavy cruiser sunk, 248 aircraft destroyed, and 3,057 personnel killed. American losses totaled 1 fleet carrier sunk, 1 destroyer sunk, 150 aircraft destroyed, and 307 personnel killed. The time factors in the battle reveal how quickly the decisive action occurred. Japanese carrier strikes and operations from launch at 4:30 in the morning until the dive bomber attack at 10 represented about 5 hours during which Japan held supremacy. The American decisive dive bomber attack lasted from 10 until 10, a span of just 6 minutes. The total battle duration extended from 4:30 on the morning of June 4th through 9 o'clock on the morning of June 5th, approximately 28 hours of continuous operations. Midway stands as history's definitive proof of several critical principles of modern warfare. Intelligence and preparation can defeat surprise and raw strength. Industrial capacity ultimately trumps warrior spirit and tactical excellence. Technological adaptation and innovation overcome initial advantages. Hubris and overconfidence remain warfare's deadliest enemies, regardless of how many previous victories have been achieved. The Japanese Navy that launched its attack against Midway on the morning of June 4th was the most powerful and experienced carrier force ever assembled to that point in naval history. By sunset that same day, that force was fundamentally broken and shattered. The Americans had achieved this reversal not through luck or accident, but through superior intelligence gathering, thorough preparation, and access to overwhelming industrial resources. In 6 minutes of brilliantly coordinated dive bomber attacks, the outcome of the Pacific War was effectively determined. Every subsequent battle, every subsequent campaign, every subsequent operation would be fought with both sides understanding that American intelligence capabilities and production capacity had already decided the ultimate result. Japan would continue fighting for 3 more years with tremendous courage and sacrifice. Japanese forces would inflict heavy casualties and win tactical victories. But the possibility of Japan achieving ultimate victory in the war died forever with those 4 carriers that burned and sank northwest of Midway Atoll on June 4, 1942. The battle provided definitive proof that modern naval warfare had fundamentally transformed into a contest of intelligence gathering, technological innovation, and industrial production capacity, rather than traditional measures of naval power. Japan entered the battle bringing superior tactics derived from extensive combat experience and highly trained personnel. America entered the battle bringing superior intelligence that revealed enemy plans and the industrial capacity to replace losses at a rate Japan could never hope to match. In the collision between these 2 approaches, the future definitively defeated the past. Traditional concepts of naval warfare based on battleship engagements and decisive fleet actions proved irrelevant in an era of aircraft carriers and industrial warfare. Midway remains the United States Navy's greatest victory, remembered and studied not merely for the tactical success achieved on that day, but for validating the fundamental proposition that democracy's industrial strength and technological innovation could overcome militaristic expertise and warrior tradition. The Japanese officers who planned the Midway operation expected an easy victory over a weakened and demoralized enemy. Instead, they encountered the beginning of their empire's end. The carefully constructed myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered forever. The strategic initiative permanently shifted to American hands. The mathematics of industrial production ensured that Japan's position would only deteriorate with each passing month. The intelligence advantage demonstrated at Midway would continue throughout the remainder of the war, giving American commanders the ability to anticipate Japanese moves and concentrate forces at decisive points. In every meaningful measure, Midway represented the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when Japan's string of victories ended and the long road to ultimate defeat began.